Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Brian Clark. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson, and I direct the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. And we are honored to have with us a couple of experts today to talk about AUKUS, the Australia, US, UK Defense Pact that is now moving into its third year of operation. So with us are Dr. Marcus Hellier, who is from Strategic Analysis Australia, as well as C2 Robotics. I'll make sure I mention that as well. So thanks for being here, Marcus.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I was here 18 months ago, I think, and we did a podcast, and it's great to be back.
And there's been a lot of progress on AUKUS, so we can talk about all the good things that have happened since then.
Maybe some progress on AUKUS. Let's not get too carried away just yet.
Excellent. And then so with us also is Dr. Chris Bassler from MITRE, where he heads up, is the Director for Integrated Deterrence. Chris and I also worked together at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, where he led a lot of aerospace and new technology studies. And then prior to that, he worked as the Chief Strategy Officer for the Joint Program Office for F-35. And then before that, he worked for the Navy in a variety of research and engineering jobs. So thanks, Dr. Chris Bassler, for being here as well.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Really appreciate it. I'm glad to be here with you and Marcus.
Well, I'm looking forward to a robust discussion. So we're here to talk about AUKUS, as I said. Has two pillars. Pillar one is the nuclear submarine deal, where Australia will receive nuclear submarines first from the U.S. and then eventually from the U.K. in terms of new build submarines. And then AUKUS Pillar two, which is the sharing of new technologies in other areas, so unmanned systems, quantum technology, electronic warfare, et cetera. So those two areas, two pillars rather, are kind of forming the avenue by which these allies have increased their defense cooperation and technology sharing. Recently, Japan was also brought in potentially as part of Pillar 2. We'll see how that develops. We can talk about that as we go. But to start with, Marcus, AUKUS Pillar 1, has been going on for a couple of years now. And we've seen a plan come out in terms of what is going to occur.
The optimal pathway.
Optimal pathway, right, of U.S. Selling some Virginia-class submarines to Australia in the 2030s. So 3 eventually, maybe even more over the course of the 2030s. And then followed by transition to a purpose-built SSN AUKUS that the U.S. or rather the U.K. and Australia will build. So how are we doing, or how is the progress going on that plan, and how do you see the road ahead?
Well, so yes, it's the so-called optimal pathway that was announced a year ago. The cynics say, well, if that's the optimal pathway, there must have been some really terrible ones, because it is a very strange pathway that we would go to all the trouble of bringing into service Virginia-class submarines, the most complex machine in the world, and get that going, and then we'll switch to a completely different submarine and build the SSN AUKUS, the UK design. So it's a very strange pathway, and one of the things missing from this whole story is why are we going down this very strange pathway? And there's a range of explanations ranging from credible to conspiracy theories, but we can maybe talk about them. But the pathway has started. I think the government in Australia is sort of saying we're kicking some big goals. So there's been legislation signed in the 3 countries allowing the sharing of technology and the underlying partnerships, which is good. There's a beginning of exchange of personnel, so Australian submariners have been trained in your nuclear submarine schools. So, things are happening, but there is a very, very long way to go. I mean, we have to set up this entire enterprise from scratch. We have to set up the facilities. We have to set up, in a sense, the human infrastructure. So, the safety systems, the regulatory systems. It's not just a matter of training submariners. I think sort of we'll get a better sense of how things are going in 2027, because that's when the so-called Submarine Rotation Force West is meant to stand up. And so that will involve the sort of longer-term deployment of a number of US and potentially UK submarine to Western Australia. And not only will that, provide an SSN presence in Australia long before we get our own ones, but it will allow the training of Australian personnel, both industry people and uniformed people. And, and I think that will be kind of a good marker point to see, is there any chance of this happening? So things have started, but still a very long way to go.
Right, absolutely, and it's a long-term plan, and I think there's options for off ramps. They don't talk about off ramps, but in reality, you could get to the point of having the SRF AUKUS or SRF West in place, have U.S. submarines operating out of Australia and UK submarines operating out of Australia. And then that ends up being kind of the nuclear submarine presence, and then Australia takes another path.
Yeah,
to its
that
undersea
sort of
force.
has been postulated as the kind of get out of jail card, that if we're overwhelmed by the complexity and the cost, because the cost is enormous, maybe we just stick with that. But I will say that we're sort of seeing, I think, in Australia, an emergence of this kind of good guys and bad guys, or sort of view that it's sort of a bit like Israel-Palestine. It's like, before I can enter the conversation, I have to declare which side my allegiance lies on. And if you're on the other side, you're clearly an idiot, and I don't have to listen to you. So we're sort of a bit in that situation where if you criticize or raise questions about AUKUS, you're sort of disloyal and trying to undermine things from within. And so as a commentator, you try and sort of remain sort of agnostic, but discuss the issues and risks. And so, I don't think we're getting off this train anytime soon in Australia, because both sides of politics are completely wedded to it. So
it sounds like it. So Chris, you worked for the Navy for a long time. We're Americans. We don't have to declare a side in the AUKUS debate necessarily. So what do you think of the likelihood that Australia is actually going to be able to stand up its own version of naval reactors and the maintenance infrastructure and the support network necessary to have its own nuclear submarines, and for us to be willing to transfer that technology over to them and accept the risk, if something goes wrong, it blows back on the U.S.?
So I think, there's tons of issues. The timelines are super long, lots of difficulties, as Marcus mentioned. So also as a veteran of many challenging acquisition programs, as you mentioned, including the F-35, there's plenty of opportunities for things to be challenging, go wrong, problematic, all those normal things that happen in most acquisition programs. I try and think about, what are some of the ways that you can keep momentum or bring stuff earlier, because even 2027, only 2.5, 3 years away, but still a ways, especially in U.S. election cycles.
Right.
As an example. So one of these kind of things is, in addition to the SRF West, in addition to what you brought up about reactors, when I've visited Australia, worked with the Australians before, worked with the Brits before, there's very much this Commonwealth approach to kind of opportunities. So a lot of Royal Navy sailors retire after their service in the Royal Navy, move to Australia, and have kind of a second career. So I'm often struck why we haven't necessarily considered a broader version of this, which could actually pool not just the submariners and the different crews. I'm sure there's plenty of people, going back to your background, that after they've finished service on Los Angeles boats or Virginia boats would love to keep going. Our system in the U.S. Navy doesn't offer that opportunity, but I think that's a way to kind of jumpstart the workforce in Australia. So that would be one. The second is with reactors and training and schoolhouse, kind of pooling all that manpower instead of having separate, differentiable bits. That might be a better way to at least initially, and then for redundancy purposes and other reasons, we could always kind of continue evolving to having secondary hubs or full complementary pieces. But I think in the near term, I very much see it as, why aren't we doing a better job about really thinking about these ways to pool our resources, including people, to really go faster.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's probably there could be a very robust expatriate community of former retired submariners like me who may want to go over there and continue, either not to necessarily serve at sea. The younger guys can, but certainly to help out ashore. With the kind of oversight and the management of the maintenance infrastructure and those kinds of things. So there's lots of ways to your point, that you can either jumpstart or complement what might be able to happen indigenously in Australia. So Chris, one other thing I wanted to bring up, along those lines is, establishing the maintenance infrastructure in Australia to support, nuclear submarines. Have you looked at the ability to do that, or is that we're going to have to send a tender there from the United States as a way to maybe start that capability up? Or how does that actually get created when you look at the SRF West and what's necessary for it?
So in terms of other things that oftentimes we have not prioritized in the U.S. Navy force structure and the force budget is, as you mentioned, submarine tenders. I've even now more than 10 years ago, did numerous design studies about submarine tenders. Unfortunately, none of those were built yet. So I think that's another opportunity where that's a not very expensive but very essential capability. And it's not just the submarine tenders for repairing the submarines, as you both know, but also rearming, providing those opportunities. And then as we see this growing plethora, which I'm sure we'll talk about in Pillar 2 of unmanned systems, especially UUVs, then having the submarine tenders also really help provide that capacity that again we don't currently have in the way that we would at least want it or envision it in the near term. So I think that's definitely a piece of it. The other thing, especially at MITRE, that we're working on is trying to help provide Australia in particular with a lot of support for digital engineering and developing that workforce and that cadre. So regardless of AUKUS, regardless of submarine, these are all the premier elements to apply this to. But as we look at different industries of the future, really bringing these digital engineering tools across the whole workforce, regardless of what they'll be applied to. And so hopefully that will kind of accelerate the industrial base across all the AUKUS members.
That's a really good point. We'll come back to that because in the study we did for the Australian Defence Force last year on unmanned systems, that came up as one of the topics where they were looking for opportunities for collaboration.
So can I just comment that your work is being read in Australia? Your great reports on autonomous systems, both to defend northern approaches to Australia and your hedging force concept. I mean, those reports are being read and being used. So thank you. They're very useful.
My pleasure. We're going to be down there and doing a war game in September to look at that. So we'll talk about that later. But so to go back to Pillar 1 to close that out a little bit. So one of the challenges that's being faced right now is the U.S. submarine force is faced with readiness difficulties. Only about of our force of around 50 submarines, maybe 38 are available today because a lot of them are in deep overhauls or maintenance. If that holds true into the next decade, we're going to be looking at a submarine force of having 35 or so operational submarines and looking to sell 10% of that potentially to Australia. So what do you think? What do you see as the appetite in Australia to actually pay for those submarines when the time comes? Because that's going to be a big bill, even used. I mean, certainly once you drive a submarine off the lot, it goes down a good 10, 20%, but it's still going to be a couple $1 billion per submarine.
I mean, as I mentioned, both sides of politics are very committed to AUKUS. So amongst the our elected leaders, there seems to be great appetite. But we've got to remember that the big bills are still a fair way down the track. I mean, I have to say that pretty much everybody I talk to in Australia who's sort of in the broader defence community, whether they're a commentator, analyst in defence industry, people inside the department speaking off the record, everyone, I think, is just incredibly concerned about the opportunity cost. That the amount of money going into this being sucked out of other programs will really kind of in a sense gut the ADF. It's that old saying, you can have SSNs or you can have a Navy. The government, when it announced the optimal pathway a year ago, set out the cost, and it said it would be between 268 and 368 billion Australian dollars over the next 30 years. Well, even in American dollars, you're looking at 250 billion. For a country our size, that's a lot of money. And they said in the next sort of financial decade, we're looking at sort of 50 to 58 billion. So you start going, well, that's going to add up very quickly. And that first decade just gets us to delivery of the first Virginia. So we're going to be spending 50 to 60 billion dollars over that decade with no operational capability in return for it. And then you layer on top of that a similar situation with our Hunter-class frigate program. It's not quite as much money, but probably 25 to 30 billion in our dollars. And you're going, that's just a huge amount of money, sunk cost before you get any capabilities. So, and I think that's a big concern with a lot of people. But then there are all of the issues of, we have no civil nuclear sector. We have one medical research reactor, and somehow we have to build, the infrastructure to operate nuclear submarines from that base. So it's going to be a huge challenge, and I'm not going to say it will fall over. I think we will get there given enough time and enough money. But I can see many things occurring that will mean it's not going to happen by 2032. Plus, in 2032 you get the first boat. Well,
Right.
one boat, as we all well know, is not a capability.
Right.
So,
Right. One boat gives you a boat that deploys 6 months or whatever every 2 years.
yeah.
It,
So,
like,
and to get to Chris's point, I think the only way it's really going to work is if we sort of regard the Australian SSN force as kind of a squadron
Yeah.
of the
Right.
broader force,
Right.
particularly of the US Navy. Much as we have a squadron of growlers, which,
Right.
to all intents and purposes, is the 13th Growler Squadron
Right.
of the US Navy.
Yeah.
Now, Australians don't really want to hear that. The government has been at huge pains to say this is a sovereign capability.
Right.
It's not an American capability. Just because the US goes to war with China over
Right.
Taiwan doesn't mean we have
Right.
to send our SSNs. But I can't really see this capability being, effective and sustainable without really being fundamentally embedded
Right.
with the US, which then raises that question of then what happens when you jump to the UK design submarine.
Right.
So-
Right. There'll be a lot of complexity involved in having, there is some commonality in the supply chains. There's, when you get down to the components, aside from maybe the reactor plant, a lot of the components are shared between the US and UK down at the component level. But there's going to be, the operations are very different. The layout is very different. The tactics are very different. So I think there would be difficulty in terms of having two different submarine classes that have very different mission sets in a lot of ways.
And that overlap will last for a very long time into the
Right.
future. So.
Right.
Brian, to your point about that on the supply chain side,
Yeah.
I think there's huge opportunity potentially for Australia, which hopefully would generate some tax revenue to
Right.
come back and pay for all
Right.
these things we're
Right.
talking about. But on standing up some of the key choke points that we've seen in the U.S. supply chain,
Right.
in the British supply chain, the commonality across it, I mean, to me at least, those are ripe for really prioritizing within Australia, being very selective, understanding the
Right.
capacity, but picking what are the most important to do. I think those at least could offer some really good opportunities.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, like pumps and valves and a lot of the mechanical equipment on submarines, those come out of a kind of a dual U.S.-UK supply chain. But when it comes to like electromagnetic components, radiation or radiators and antennas and all those kinds of
Yeah.
things, there's obviously opportunities with Australia to have a much larger role.
And for
in
high
that.
value add in terms of those supply chain companies.
Yeah, definitely. They can get a good margin on those.
Well, that is the line the government is taking. I mean, they're sort of ultimately trying to sell this as an industry program
Right.
to the Australian voter and taxpayer. Well,
Right. There's
Again,
gotta be-
one doesn't want to be too cynical, but
Right.
we've been a partner with the US in the ANBYG-1 combat
Right.
system, so the
Right.
combat system on your submarines and
Yeah.
our submarines. And to date, there's been virtually no Australian industry involvement there. So,
Right. And
you
that-
don't want to be too cynical, but
No.
things need to change.
Right, and that's one of the concerns I have is that you've got a very well established supply chain right now for Virginia class.
Yep.
The
Very hard to break in.
Right, exactly. But I think there's places on the edges, like Chris is mentioning here, where mission systems,
Or even capacity limits, because
Right.
we've clearly seen that Secretary Del Toro has been talking about let's go faster. Well,
Right.
if we have a capacity limit, that's one way to offset that capacity limit.
right. Well, and readiness. I mean, if there is a maintenance capacity in Australia, that can help to alleviate some of the shortfalls we have today. Because that is one area where there is just a lack of capacity. It's not just it's not money. It's maintenance of submarines is certainly a capacity issue. But to put some context on the dollar amount you're talking about there, if you're looking at $250 billion investment in U.S. dollars over 20 years, that's about half of what the U.S. Navy spends on its own ship procurement, right? So that's half of the shipbuilding budget of what the U.S. would spend over that 20 years. So you're looking at a very sizable investment on the Australians' part.
It is sizable, and when you look at the UK nuclear programs, I mean, they are really just sort of hanging on.
Yeah.
All of the reviews that are done by their accountability agencies say, man, these guys are really hanging on. A report was done recently saying they're massively underfunded over the coming decade. And so, one of the theories of why are we going down this strange path of getting UK submarines? And at some level, I go, well, the UK strategic deterrent, it's really just hanging on. Every decade or so, they have a big debate about do we want to keep the cost of this going? I think the US wants the UK to have a strategic deterrent. You can really only do it. You can only have 4 SSBNs as part of a broader nuclear fleet. You can't every 30 years just build 4 SSBNs and then crew them. So my feeling is that the US wants the UK to succeed, but they've got to inject scale into it, and the only way to do that is to find this Aussie angel investor who's going to start pumping cash into it to generate some scale.
That's a really good argument. I guess from the UK side, the issue, is also trying to be able to continue the continuous production of submarines. So if they do SS AUKUS, can they back up the follow on to the Astute class to the point where now you get more or less continuous production of submarines, and that helps to keep the industrial base going.
They've got continuous production, but to do that they have to stretch the drumbeat out so long. So they produce a submarine like every 3 years.
Right.
I mean, it's not terribly efficient.
Not very efficient. No, definitely. So this brings up one of the things we talked about before we started was what's a plan B. So let's say we start going down this road and the money just becomes too rich for people's blood in Australia, and some future government says we've got to come up with an off ramp, or what are we going to do instead? So Chris, what are some of the ways that we might think about what if we start down this path and after the first submarine, people in Australia start to really question whether the investment's worth it?
So I think, one potential plan B that perhaps is the most or the least disruptive but the most problematic, what Marcus talked about for the sovereign capability, would really be to take this look that it's an entire alliance force structure element. And so for that, you really have co-crewed submarines. You would have the maintenance forward. I mean, really accelerating and stepping on the gas for that kind of construct. The other plan B, I think, would be to take a lot of the industrial capacity and a lot of the workforce that's being developed for the submarines and really pump it into unmanned vehicles and have that be kind of the massive investment in unmanned squadron forward that then would complement the rest of the alliance submarine force. So that's maybe two options that at least start to get that path, but also leverage as much as possible all the investments and the efforts that have already started and are underway.
Right, which to your point, Marcus, we have to start thinking about that now. So if there's going to be a plan B that involves treating this as an alliance asset, right? So these submarines end up being not necessarily U.S. or Australian. They're kind of controlled by dual crews, and you've got opportunities to have folks serving on a submarine that maybe Australian owned or maybe U.S. owned. But that's something you got to start thinking about now. You can't have that be necessarily something you do at the last minute.
Yeah, I mean, that idea of you're in an alliance, and particularly if you're the smaller partner, you can't have the full smorgasbord of capability, so you rely on your larger alliance partner for some of them. We've been doing that with nukes, with nuclear weapons for a very, very long time, and other capabilities. So, yes, one solution would be to take similar approach to SSNs, but that would be, require, a fundamental change of approach from our government. When I was here 18 months ago, before the AUKUS partners put out the optimal pathway, and before the Australian government had published the Defence Strategic Review that it commissioned, which was meant to be a fundamental re-examination of our defence policy settings. I was here and I said, well, maybe we should just think about B-21.
Right.
If what you want is a long-range strike capability, a deterrent capability, conventional deterrent capability, and basically sink a bunch of ships coming through Australia's northern approaches, B-21 would do that. But the Defence Strategic Review explicitly ruled that out. It didn't say why. It just said, well, we're not going to do it. But I agree with Chris that the plan B you have to be doing, and this is not a plan B that sort of sits on the shelf. It's not a break glass in case of emergency plan B, but it's a plan B that we need to be doing simultaneously. And that is much more rigorously exploiting the potential of the smaller smart and the many, those cheap, hopefully disposable, uncrewed systems that we're starting to see and obviously being used to great effect in Ukraine. Also in the Red Sea, where the Houthis, the underdog, the little guy, is using this asymmetric capability to really stymie the world's most powerful navy. So, but we can talk about this in more detail. But Obviously, there are obstacles to employing those capabilities, but I think we are making demonstrable progress in that area.
Which brings up, AUKUS Pillar Two really is supposed to be about these alternative or emerging technologies, quantum technology, space technology, electromagnetic technologies, unmanned technologies. And we've seen some examples of cooperation there. That Autonomous Warrior, which is the annual exercise that's done by the Australian Defence Force to look at unmanned systems, that's incorporated a lot of U.S. companies and U.S. systems. And Australia has a lot of companies that are developing unmanned systems now, many of which have relevance to the kinds of use cases the U.S. is likely to face. So there's opportunities there for both ways of technology to be transferred, as opposed to just being the U.S. and U.K. sending technology to Australia. So how is Australia doing at bringing these technologies forward into the force? Because that was something that we wrote about in that one report, is how do you actually introduce these into the field as opposed to them merely being experimental systems?
Well, so when I was at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, I essentially for 5 years felt I was banging my head against the wall writing about this stuff, saying we've got to get much more serious about it. And, in the grand scheme of things, it's small dollars, and also not that much industry capacity needed for this. We're starting to see some progress there. So our new ASCA, the Advanced Strategic Capabilities Accelerator, which is our kind of version of DARPA or DIU, is starting to do some things in that area. Since I work now with C2 Robotics, which is a company that works in the autonomous systems field, I've sort of got this first-hand view, from the industry side. And, I think we are seeing green shoots, and it's quite encouraging. Even in a country the size of Australia, there are lots of companies that can do this stuff. And in some level, and, we see it with the Houthis, with the Iranians, with the the Ukrainians, everybody, these technologies have proliferated. So it is not hard to do a lot of this stuff. Obviously, the more autonomy you want, the more range you want, the more complexity, i.e. the more you want it to look like a traditional manned platform, the harder it is. But I think one of the reasons we're starting to sort of see real progress is, even at the start of this journey, people were going, well, we're not looking at these as direct replacements for manned platforms, but I think there was still always the temptation, and your Ghost fleet, which is a great capability, but in some ways it is a bit of a uncrewed copy of a traditional crewed fleet. But if you sort of start from first principles and say, we just want to do one thing, you don't actually need a lot of autonomy to do that. So you can actually do something pretty well if you're just trying to do one thing. And I think that's where we're sort of people are starting to go, I get it. I get autonomy. And if I'm doing one thing, it doesn't need to be complex, and we truly can break out of that kind of cost capability death spiral that we're all so familiar with of your manned platforms becoming so exquisite that they cost so much and take so long to design and build that you end up with vanishingly small quantities of them. I think by really stripping back our expectations of autonomous systems, in a sense, it's allowing us to really start to see that you can break out of that death spiral.
And what we've seen in our most recent research for the U.S. Navy is a lot of that death spiral comes from the operations and support costs. So it's not just that the thing costs more to buy if you make it more complicated and more sophisticated. It's also that down the road it's more expensive to maintain, it's more expensive to crew, it's more expensive to operate. And that's what constrains the size of the U.S. force in a lot of ways when you look into the 2030s, is the fact that we just built such expensive stuff that it takes so much money to maintain it and crew it that we can't keep it. We have to start retiring it early. So Chris, you're a technology guy. You come out of the world of aerospace engineering and naval engineering. So a question is going to be to what. So I think the idea of functional decomposition that Marcus talks about seems like exactly the right path to be able to get something into the field that can be utilized effectively and combined with other systems to effectuate a kill chain or to implement a use case.
I think you especially with the Mosaic efforts that you did with DARPA before, a number of other people have really written about this. I think there's huge opportunities to basically not only provide key supplements and enablers, whether we're talking about extending the kill chains, we're talking about long dwell sensor opportunities, all these allow for much more customization of the joint force overall. The other part is that it also allows much higher adaptation. Now, I'll come back to this in a second in terms of some of the stuff that we've seen in Ukraine that I think is very interesting. But one thing that's often been difficult, especially in the U.S. system, and I'm hoping the Australians might show us a path of a way to avoid this mindset, but especially for unmanned aerial systems, maybe more so than the surface or undersea fleet. Over the last couple of decades, there very much has been this thought process of trying to consider them as airframes and air platforms. And as you guys were just talking about, just take the pilot out, but it's all the same redundancies and cost and even airworthiness certifications that slows down the fielding, which doesn't make sense for an unmanned platform. And so to a certain extent, we collectively have kind of done ourselves a disservice by thinking of these as platforms and not, loitering UAS and small UAS. No, they're just cruise missiles. They're cruise missiles with different capabilities.
They're ammunition.
Yeah, some go boom, some don't. Some are more expendable. Some you can return and use later. But I think if we really adopted much more of that weaponeering mindset and actually put it more in the weapons community, I think we'd actually be able to go faster and not have as many issues as we do with some of the platforms. So I think there's huge opportunities for the USVs, UUVs, to look at them in that way. So,
that's a really good point. I mean, it also, in the hedge force, one of the things we found is when we worked with the policy people in DoD about autonomous weapon regulations, right? So if you treat these as unmanned systems, it gets very hairy in terms of what's the limitations on autonomy if this thing's going to deploy a weapon? But if you instead treat it as a weapon and say, well, this is just like a cruise missile or a mine or any other weapon that once you launch it, it's going to pursue the target that it's been programmed to go pursue, then those rules become very streamlined, because we all understand how that works, and we've already made the rules accommodate that. But
my favorite joint force system is always, if you had an airframe that could do terrain mapping and target selection and all this, that would be terrible. We shouldn't do that. It's called Tomahawk.
Exactly. That's for 40 years, right? Right. But we got a rule set that because we built the rules to accommodate that, because we're like, well, we got the Tomahawk. We're going to write these rules. We got to make the rules accommodate the Tomahawk.
Exactly.
But if you want to introduce something new that maybe doesn't have ammunition on it,
I think the capabilities of autonomous systems are now kind of completely outstripping our old processes and regulations and institutions. So, for example, I'll just put my C2 robotics hat on for a moment. And so we make the Speartooth large uncrewed underwater vessel, a robot submarine.
Right.
It can carry a payload, multiple thousand kilometers, so it has huge range. We say we're at minimum viable capabilities is sort of buzzword that's taken off in Australia recently, i.e. it's the idea that, we'll try and be happy with 80% solutions and not 110% solutions. So,
we used to call that good engineering.
Sorry?
We used to call that good engineering.
But perfect engineering.
And that is part of, I think, of the why we are starting to make progress with autonomous systems is we're happy with, that sort of 80% solution. But so we've got this submarine that can theoretically go multiple thousand kilometres, but the Australian Maritime Safety Authority says every time it's in the water, it needs to be accompanied by a manned vessel. And so it's like we're trying to test this thing that can go thousands of kilometres. Well, a boat that can go thousands of kilometres is known as a ship. So if we want to test it to its capabilities, we need to escort it with a ship, and of course, all of those the advantages of the small, the smart, and the many that you can test, go out the window, and so our institutions, our regulations just aren't really keeping up.
Right, but you can see with capabilities like that where you functionally decompose and you sort of focus on a narrow set of attributes in the system. You could see how you can get to a path where that could be definitely a complement to or an augmentation of the submarine force. Where if we don't get quite to the number of submarines we're hoping with AUKUS SSN or with the number that they buy from the U.S., you could see there being an alliance force that is composed of some number of manned SSNs that are U.S. or Australian built. They're operating out of Australia, and they're complemented by undersea vehicles that are going to be able to do some of those missions.
Yeah, but that sort of gets at the issue of ConOps, and one of the criticisms of autonomous systems is like, well, what's actually the ConOps? And we build these things, and what do you do with them?
Yeah.
And I've sort of kind of my thinking's moved on a bit. So 5 years ago, I was fully in the Humpty camp, of the human unmanned teaming was the way to go.
Yeah.
And so you're looking at, every crewed platform would be a mothership.
Right.
And
a bunch of little buddies.
Your littoral combat ship was kind of meant to be that, and that didn't go so well. And so I've sort of moved away from the Humpty concept, basically because you are still tied to that exquisite manned platform.
Right.
And so you've still got that, in a sense, single point of failure there. And we're now seeing uncrewed systems that have huge range, whether it's ours, Speartooth, or UAVs, the disposable UAVs that can go thousands of kilometres. And, well, if they can get to the fight themselves, why do you want to put your super stealthy, platform or thing on this big floating target?
Right.
And so... Yeah, I agree that these things can, if you don't have enough SSNs, these things can be a complement. But I don't really want to start by designing my ConOps around that.
No, I mean, as a complement,
platform.
meaning it would go do something instead of the submarine, as opposed to being with the submarine. Yeah, definitely. So one of the, Chris, I'd be interested in your opinion on this. So it seems like originally the idea with man-unmanned teaming was, well, we're in these contested environments, we need the ability to provide direction to the unmanned system when we can't talk to it from long ways away. But it seems like with Starlink and with the advent of pretty ubiquitous satellite communications, maybe we don't need that. I mean, maybe that unmanned system can get targeting updates or can get guidance updates, far away from where the manned forces are. You don't need that, manned teammate, to be there to provide command and control. I mean, that was the idea behind, NGAD in a lot of ways, was you're going to have this highly penetrating manned aircraft that would manage unmanned systems in these contested areas, and maybe that's not necessary in the future.
Yeah, and we saw this a lot in the air domain, especially over the last several years. Exactly to this point, that if so imagine the F-35, right? And so the F-35's actual key mission, despite all the multi-role, is really about door kicker for the Joint Force and doing the SEAD mission. So that's the main mission. But if you're going to have all these unmanned escorts that also have to have the same level of stealth, the same level of range, the same weapons, it's the same platform. That's the engineering solution that comes out at the end. And so trying to design something that's going to be, fielded in large quantities, be very affordable, but it's the same design solution, then just build more F-35s. Easy answer. So in this case, I think decoupling the technologies you brought up, there's a lot of opportunities for that. The autonomy itself, I think, has advanced quite significantly, that where people had maybe misconceptions or lack of understanding before, or just hadn't proved itself, in terms of a lot of the ranges and demonstrations and exercises. There's a lot more missions that actually can be done. And so whether it's having a pocket of unmanned systems that are really going to extend the eyes and ears for the Joint Force, provide diversionary tactics, have different other, assault plans or things like that. There's a whole range of solutions that it doesn't really need to be truly tethered, side by side. There's a lot of opportunity there.
Well, and that brings up the point you brought earlier now, coming back to the idea of digital engineering, because one of the challenges has always been you have to be able to form up that use case and describe it to people so that then you can go and figure out what the system of systems is that's necessary to implement that use case. And then what does that mean for whatever mission systems or adaptations you need to make to the existing unmanned vehicles, because it's hard to make these unmanned vehicles compelling unless you can kind of give people a vision of what the use cases might be. But you have to do that with enough fidelity that the engineers are also compelled. It's not just the policymakers. So do you see this is an area where the ADF mentioned to us that this was a weakness or a shortfall they had. They didn't have a strong modeling and simulation architecture or system. They don't have digital engineering to the degree that we have here. So how do you see that evolving, and how is Australia doing at implementing those tools?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of appetite. There is proficiency that was there already. It's the same scale challenge that we see in many other issues. So there was a base to work from, which is great. But I think really scaling that up and actually doing more reps and sets, as Marcus mentioned, and we've seen in a lot of the defense programs, the problem is your digital engineering process, and we have the same challenge here, is drawn out over years and years and years of doing updates to frigates or SSNs or Joint Strike Fighters and all these things, which is a very long process. So if we're able to apply this much more to some of the unmanned systems, you can do reps in the more like the months style and be able to go all the way from design concept, different con-op, let's go test it, let's build it, let's build a prototype, let's go take it to the range, the great ranges that are available in Australia, to actually go and test them there. Not just for the Aussies, but for everybody, frankly. And so that's, I think, a huge opportunity in really changing that whole cycle time and being able to go very fast, which is also great because it makes countries like China really think, well, what countermeasures should I even spend time developing on? Let me go start my countermeasure effort, and then, oh no, 6 months later we have a totally different set of functions that we're going after.
It's funny you should mention that because some Ukrainian analysts were out in Canberra recently, and I met them, and I'd read a piece that said the Ukrainians were now making 100,000 drones a month, and families were sitting around their dining table, like assembling them, and they were aiming to do 2 million this year. And so we're talking to these analysts, and one of them said, Ukraine's trying to make 1,000 drones. And we're like, well, that doesn't sound like many. And they're like, no, 1,000 kinds of drones. And we're like, wow, why so many? And they said, well, you've just got this kind of ecosystem where if you're doing that many, the good ones will emerge. But it also makes it really hard for the Russians because they just don't know what's coming. And every drone requires countermeasures, and so it just complicates, the picture for the Russians so much.
And it's the victory garden mentality because you have, the resources that are available is what you can make use of, and so that's a great way for people to contribute then in that time of crisis.
Well, and it's maybe a different way of thinking about mobilization, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, what Ukraine has taught us is that you could end up stockpiling obsolescence. If you stockpile a bunch of weapons in advance, Ukraine found once GPS jamming was common on the front lines, JDAMs weren't working, Scalp weren't working, so they were having to come up with different ways to navigate these weapons to their targets. So you have to be able to, adapt or to build things on the fly using the supply chain that you've got available to you. So, maybe that's a different approach to mobilization, is thinking about how do we assemble, from the parts we can get a hold of at scale, what can we do with that to create weapons or to create, capabilities that are needed for the front line.
One other part with the digital engineering, though, too, is in that we oftentimes, it's very easy to think hardware-centric, and so building different types of drones, in this case for Ukraine, is great. What we've seen also in a lot of the reporting, both from the ground and then even some of the recent news reporting, is also that without thinking about the actual electronics, the linkages, so we need, with software-defined radios and other apertures that are available even with, consumer electronics, we also need kind of that workforce that's available as part of this to go through those cycle times so that we're actually able to field and adapt, on some of the hardening for electronic warfare and those kind of things, not just the cool propellers and the is it a quadcopter and all those kinds of things.
Well, and that brings up an opportunity for Australia, right? Because if we're thinking about this being an alliance effort on unmanned systems, clearly Australia is already developing its own indigenous unmanned system ecosystem. That you've seen, several companies have fielded new systems. But if we were looking at trying to mobilize and generate these systems at scale in support of a potential warfighting effort, there's certainly a lot of those parts that are going to be available, from Australian manufacturers, and that we could be building drones in each domain, from parts that are coming from Australia as well as the U.S. Different from the submarine industrial base, which is this very bespoke, highly regulated area.
This sort of, I don't want to get too ontological here, but it does get at the issue of what actually is AUKUS.
Yeah.
Are we sort of saying we're going to replicate production lines across all three countries? Well, that doesn't seem super efficient. Or is it we're going to go, well, we've got smart people in all three countries, and if smart people in one country come up with something good, then we're not going to duplicate it, we're just going to get it from there. But then you go, well, is the US really going to rely on Australia for a critical capability? That seems a little implausible. Or is it that we're just going to get all of our smart people together and magic will happen? And I think, it's the challenge with AUKUS Pillar 2 at the moment is we're not quite sure what we're doing there. And I think it's probably going to be different on a case-by-case basis. But the other challenge is, and as a former defence bureaucrat, the problem is we said we're going to do it and then threw it over to the defence bureaucrats who, quite frankly, aren't good at technology, aren't really good at industry. They may be good at big policy settings, but they're not necessarily the best people to say, here's the best opportunities in terms of potential technologies. Here's the best ways for us all to work together. And I think we need to do a lot better at bringing industry into that AUKUS Pillar 2 kind of enterprise. And I do find it a little interesting that the Japanese want to join. And it's like, well, what are you actually joining? What have we actually achieved so far? I mean, I know it's sort of it's the cool kids club, so people want to get in. But in terms of actual runs on the board, there's not a lot to point at so far.
But you could see how if Pillar 2 is a lot about unmanned systems, Japan needs unmanned systems. They are trying to come up with ways to expand the reach and the persistence and capability of the JSDF without growing it in terms of people because of demographic challenges.
We've all got that problem.
Right. And so they want to use unmanned systems to help be that augmentation to the manned force. And maybe that's an area where there could be a lot of technology cooperation. And I think, to your point, Marcus, maybe this is a lot of like we're all putting our, everything together and seeing, what's best of breed amongst what each country is able to bring, because I think certainly there's systems in Australia that would be useful for some of the U.S. use cases and vice versa.
Oh, yeah, we'd be very happy to sell Speartooth to the U.S.
I'm sure. And then obviously in the U.S. there's lots of technology, but I think the sort of unsung hero here is the modeling and simulation, the digital engineering. I mean that really is where a lot of the the work has to get done because physical experimentation like autonomous warrior is very cool visually, but it's not a very efficient way to come up with new ideas and evaluate their effectiveness. You got to have a way to do reps and sets.
Yep. So in my mind, especially with the different technology efforts when I was working at ONR and even before then when I was at the Navy labs, we had a lot of great AUKUS technology cooperation in emerging technology. There's been AUKUS quantum efforts, autonomy, basically every emerging technology you can think of for many, many, many years. So one possibility might be to kind of reformulate what Pillar 2 actually is and have Pillar 2 be much more as what I think many people maybe understand it as is the emerging technology piece. Pool that, but with a bent to what Marcus talked about with how do we go from just the scientists getting together and combine them or protect them from the defense bureaucrats to really couple with industry and say, how are we going to transition this from kind of the laboratory and the research environment into something that can actually be useful as products? But then spin out maybe a few things that are a little bit more near term. So especially when we're thinking about the robotics, the unmanned vehicles, not the autonomy algorithms, I think that maybe could still fit in that Pillar 2 piece. But I almost think there's a Pillar 3, and very much without overwhelming, all the other efforts, not trying to dilute Pillar 1 or Pillar 2. But I think both of those, in my mind, are very much these long-term generational things, looking to 2040 and beyond, and all these elements. But there's a much more near-term that I think is actually even more needed, which is if we think about the Australian guided weapons enterprise, the GWO efforts, our shortages or issues with potential munitions productions, same for the Brits, focusing kind of a Pillar 3 that would really be on munitions and weapons and the parts of unmanned vehicles that fit also within that are less vehicles, more weapons. I think that could really be a near-term focus. It also could kind of give these lessons learned for digital engineering, for production, for making NTIB real. We've had this congressional help for many years on, hey, look, you have all the authorizations you do to really think about this pooled industrial base, and we haven't really actualized that. And I think it's too difficult to kind of do it in this nebulous state, so we should pick really specific opportunities. And the submarine, as we were talking about, the unmanned vehicles that we're talking about, those are maybe stretch goals for now, but starting with, what we all have a huge need for is more weapons, and maybe keeping that as the near-term focus.
That's a great point. I mean, it's very focused, right? So, and the use cases are well defined. You can sort of back up from that to
handful of the most important weapons, not all the weapons,
right? And you can also open up the opportunity for things that are maybe not preferred weapons in the U.S. Maybe that's something we need to do more of because they're more available from what our allies have.
Forward,
right.
Yeah. I kind of agree in some ways. So yes, we do have this guided weapons enterprise where the government has said we're going to make guided weapons here, both for ourselves and to help our partners out. But as we're seeing in the Red Sea, if you're using SM2s and SM6s to shoot down drones, you're losing. It doesn't matter how many of them you're making. Yes, we should probably be setting up more production for some of those exquisite munitions, but I think, Pillar 2 really needs to be looking at ways, again, to break out of that cycle of the $2-3 million munition and looking at, the smaller smart than many, so how you can leverage.
But you could almost bifurcate it into this Pillar 3 that would actually be 2 flavors. One that would be the high-end weapons, the SM2s, SM3s, SM6s, LRASM, all these things that we need more of. But to your point about the Houthis, there's also, not just for the Australians and for the U.S., but for everyone, along the first island chain, what are the opportunities we can give them to basically enable them to do to the Houthis what the Houthis are doing, but
Correct.
to the Chinese within the first island chain? And they don't need necessarily Tomahawks and SM6s and all that. There's plenty of other higher quantity opportunities.
What's the best way that Australia can help the Taiwanese should the Chinese try and invade? Is it sending a destroyer or a submarine, or is it sending 100,000 killer drones?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I think that's, but when I took from your Pillar 3 discussion is it's a lot more about that probably because that's the area where we can really cooperate. And we're not going to build another SM6 factory in Australia. That just seems impractical. But you could certainly come up with the capacity to build a lot of weapons / drones that are, fall in that category.
Even though it is impractical, I still would argue actually we should do it just for the whole contested logistics and disrupted homeland and ability to at least just have an alternative second source forward, and maybe it has a little bit of the tarps over the factory for now or something, but at least have that possibility.
The government has agreed and funded the establishment of a production line for GMLRS, so HIMARS rounds. And the first rounds are meant to be, I think, rolling off the production line next year. Although, of course, the cynics say, well, it's simply just US rounds that have kind of been disassembled a bit, shipped over, and being reassembled there. But again, this area of sort of really cheap, affordable munitions. That's an area where there are a number of companies in Australia are working on that, and I think pretty close to success. And we're actually now, I think, for the first time, really seeing defence sort of taking that seriously. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
That's great. Well, cautiously optimistic. That's a good place to end, I think, the discussion, because if we talk further, we might talk ourselves back into being cautiously pessimistic. I want to thank you both for being here. So thank you very much, Dr. Marcus Hellier, Dr. Chris Bassler from MITRE. We appreciate you taking the time. And Marcus, thanks for stopping in on your visit to the United States. And safe travels back to Down Under. And I'll see you there in the fall, I guess.
I certainly hope so.
All right. Thank you very much.
Brian.